There is a woman on horseback, riding hard through a cloud of red dust, and behind her, somewhere in the distance, there is the sound of fighting. It is 1836, and the woman's name is Nana Asma'u, and she is 43 years old, and she is fleeing the Khilafah that her father built. The state that she watched being born when she was 11 years old is under attack, and the women of the Caliphal family have been told to run. She is not a soldier and she is not carrying a weapon, but she is carrying something else, something she has carried with her through every upheaval of her extraordinary life. And that is the ability to take what she sees and what she feels and turn it into words that other people will carry in their memories long after the dust has settled and the dead have been buried. Later, she will write a poem about this day. She will call it Wakra Ghuwai, the Song of the Circling. And in it, she will describe the chaos of the flight, the dust rising behind the horses, the families being torn apart in the confusion, the women clutching children in litters as the ground shook beneath them, and the terrible not knowing of whether the men they left behind would still be alive when the running was over. But that poem comes later. Right now, she is just riding, and the dust is in her eyes, and the world is loud with the sound of things falling apart. If you listened to part 1 of this series, you already know the broad outline of Nana Asma''s story. How she was born into a family of scholars in what is now northern Nigeria, how her father, Othman Dan Fodio, launched the Sokoto Jihad in 1804 when she was 11 years old, how she grew up to become a poet and scholar who wrote in 4 languages and advised the Khalifa of the largest state in 19th century Africa. But what part 1 could only sketch, because there was so much ground to cover, was the texture of what her life actually felt like in the middle decades. The years between the founding of the Khilafah and the creation of the Yan Taru. The years when war came back and the people she loved most began to die. And the years when grief and loss became the raw material out of which she would build something that no one, in centuries of trying, has ever been able to destroy. This episode is about those years. It is about what war sounds like when you are riding through it on horseback. It is about what loss sounds like when you write it down in verse. And it is about what happens when a woman who has spent her entire life watching things fall apart decides, in the aftermath of one final devastating loss, that she is going to build something that cannot fall. After the jihad succeeded and the major Hausa city-states had fallen, there was a period of relative stability in the Sokoto Khilafah, roughly from about 1812 to the mid-1830s, when the hard work of governing replaced the hard work of fighting, and the Dan Fodio family settled into the rhythms of running a state that stretched across a vast swath of the West African Sahel. Asma''s father, Othman Dan Fodio, had retired from active leadership after the jihad and spent his final years in scholarship and contemplation, leaving the day-to-day governance to his son Muhammad Bello, who became the second Khalifa. Dan Fodio died in 1817, when Asma' was approximately 24 years old, and she wrote an elegy for him that is among the most moving pieces of literature produced in 19th century West Africa. And I say moving, not in the vague sense that critics use the word, but in the specific sense that when you read it, even in translation, even across 2 centuries and a language barrier, and the vast cultural distance between Sokoto in 1817 and wherever you are sitting right now, you can feel the weight of the loss. Not because the poem tells you how important Dan Fodio was, other people wrote those assessments, but because it tells you what his absence felt like, the specific shape of the hole that was left in a family and in a community when the person at its center was gone. This is what Asma''s elegies do that no other historical source from this period can do. They are not records of events, they are records of feeling. And for a historian trying to understand what it was actually like to live through the founding of the Sokoto Khilafah, they are irreplaceable. She had married Ghadat Dan Lima, who served as wazir, the chief minister and closest advisor to Khalifat Bello, which meant that Asma' was positioned at the intersection of scholarship and political power in a way that almost no other woman in the Khilafah could match. She advised her brother on matters of state. She corresponded with scholars across the Muslim world, and she wrote prolifically and constantly, producing theological works, historical accounts, and the elegies that would become some of the most important primary sources we have for this period of West African history. And it is worth pausing here to talk about what those elegies actually were, because the word elegy in English tends to conjure images of something formal and restrained. a dignified poem read at a funeral, and that is not at all what Asma was doing. Her elegies were acts of witness. They named specific people, not generals or khalafa, but ordinary fighters, specific battles, specific moments of courage and sacrifice, and they did so in language that was designed not for a literary audience, but for a community that needed to remember its dead. When a warrior fell in defense of the Khilafah, Asma''s poem ensured that his name would not disappear into the dust along with his body. She was, in effect, the memory of the state, the keeper of the names that the official histories would never bother to record. And this function, this role as the community's memory keeper, is something that is easy to undervalue if you think of poetry as decoration or entertainment. But in a predominantly oral culture, where most people could not read, and where the official written records were kept in Arabic by a small clerical class, the person who composed the poems that ordinary people memorized and recited was the person who controlled what was remembered and what was forgotten. Asma did not just mourn the dead, she decided which dead would be remembered, and how, and by whom. And that is a form of power that is invisible on any organizational chart, but that shapes a community's sense of itself more profoundly than any political decree. And then, in 1836, the relative calm of those middle years shattered. A coalition of enemies, remnants of the old Hausa kingdoms that had never fully accepted the Sokoto Khilafah's authority, launched an attack from the direction of Gwandu, the western administrative center of the Khilafah. And the fighting came close, much closer than it had in years, close enough that the caliphal family in Sokoto was told to prepare for the worst. Now, to understand what this looked like on the ground, you need to remember what the Sahel terrain is actually like, because it is not a place that offers much in the way of natural protection. The land is flat, stretching to the horizon in every direction, scrubby grassland and scattered acacias, and the occasional massive baobab tree. And when a force attacks across that kind of terrain, there is nowhere to hide, and not much time to react. The harmattan dust would have made it worse, reducing visibility, coating everything in a fine, gritty haze that gets into your eyes and your throat and makes the approaching danger feel like it is coming from everywhere at once. Asma and the other women of the caliphal household were evacuated. She later described this flight in Wak, Guai, the song of the circling, and the images in the poem are vivid in a way that second-hand accounts simply cannot match. She describes women being carried in litters, the bumping and jolting as the carriers moved quickly over rough ground, children crying, the confusion of families being separated in the rush to move, dust everywhere, and the sound of fighting somewhere behind them, close enough to hear, but far enough away that you could not tell who was winning. And I want you to sit with that image for a moment, because it is easy to read the phrase, "the women were evacuated," and move past it, as if evacuation is a clean and orderly process, a calm departure with luggage and arrangements. But evacuation in the 19th century Sahel, with an enemy force advancing across flat terrain, meant chaos. It meant leaving behind your home, your possessions, your compound full of books and manuscripts, and the accumulated material of your life, and moving as fast as you could with children and elderly family members and whatever you could carry, across open ground, in heat, in dust, with no certainty about where you were going or whether the place you were going to would still be safe when you got there. Asma herself rode on horseback, a woman in her 40s moving through a war zone, and the poem does not romanticize this. It does not describe her as brave or defiant or stoic. It describes her as afraid, as praying, as uncertain whether she would survive the day. And that honesty is part of what makes her war poetry so powerful. She is not writing propaganda. She is not trying to make the Khilafah look invincible. She is telling you what it actually felt like to be a civilian in the middle of a military crisis. And the answer is that it felt terrifying and chaotic and deeply uncertain. And then the battle was won, or at least the immediate threat was repelled, and the women returned to Sokoto, and Asma sat down and wrote. She wrote about the fighters who had fallen, naming them individually, describing their courage and their sacrifice. And she wrote about the experience of fleeing, the dust and the fear and the prayers and the relief of survival. And those poems circulated through the community, recited aloud, memorized, passed from person to person, so that the Battle of Gawakuke would not be remembered as an abstract entry in a timeline, but as a lived experience, with specific faces and specific losses and specific moments of human terror and human resilience. And here is something about war poetry that I think is worth sitting with, because it tells you something about the role that Asma played in her community that goes beyond scholarship in the conventional sense. When a society goes through a traumatic event, whether it is a battle or a natural disaster or a civil crisis, the people who live through it need to process what happened. They need to make sense of it. They need to integrate it into their understanding of who they are and what their community has endured. In modern societies, we have journalists and historians and therapists and memorial services and all the institutional infrastructure of collective processing. In the Sokoto Khilafah, they had Asma'. She was the person who took the raw, chaotic, terrifying experience of battle and displacement and loss and shaped it into language that a community could hold, could share, could recite together, and in doing so, could begin to heal from. Her poems about Gawakuke did not erase the fear or the grief, but they gave those feelings a structure, a form, a shared language that allowed people to talk about what had happened and to place it within a larger narrative of faith and perseverance and divine deliverance. She was not just documenting history, she was helping her community survive it. And then, 1 year later, in 1837, the blow fell that nothing in Asma''s life had prepared her for. Her brother Muhammad Bello, who had been Khalifa for 20 years, who had relied on her as a political advisor and intellectual companion since the death of their father, who was her closest ally in the government, and the person she had spent her adult life standing beside in the work of building and maintaining the Khilafah, died. Bello's death was not just a personal loss for Asma', although it was that, profoundly and devastatingly. It was a political earthquake. He had held the Khilafah together through force of personality and political skill, and when he died, the question of who would succeed him did not have a clean or obvious answer. A succession crisis erupted. Factions formed around different candidates, and the Khilafah, the thing that Asma''s father had walked into the desert to build, and that her brother had spent 2 decades holding together, began to tear itself apart from the inside. There was civil war. Not the kind of war that comes from an external enemy attacking your borders, which is terrible, but at least simple in its moral clarity, but the kind that comes from the people who are supposed to be on your side turning against each other. Neighbors against neighbors, cousins against cousins, men who had fought together in the jihad, now fighting each other over who would inherit the thing they had all sacrificed to build. And this is, in many ways, a more devastating kind of conflict than any external threat, because it destroys not just lives and property, but something more fundamental: the bonds of trust and shared purpose that hold a community together, the sense of common identity that makes people willing to cooperate and sacrifice and work towards something larger than themselves. And for Asma', who had spent her entire life inside this community, who had watched it being born and had written its history and mourned its dead and celebrated its victories, watching it tear itself apart must have been a particular kind of agony. The kind that comes not from physical danger, but from the destruction of meaning, from watching the thing you have given your life to begin to consume itself from within. Asma' wrote an elegy for Bello, and when you read that elegy, knowing everything she had already lost and everything she was about to lose in the civil strife that followed, the grief in it is not just personal but structural. The grief of watching an institution crack, of seeing the thing your family built with blood and sacrifice and 20 years of patient governance begin to fracture along lines that no poem and no prayer could hold together. And it is in this context, in this specific moment of loss and fracture and institutional crisis, that Asma' makes the decision that will define her legacy more than anything else she ever did. She decides to build the Yan Taru. And I think it is important to understand the connection between what came before and what came after, because the Yan Taru is often presented as a kind of standalone achievement, a clever educational innovation that Asma' dreamed up in a moment of inspiration. And that framing misses the point entirely. The Yan Taru was born out of crisis. It was born out of civil war and the death of a brother and the terrifying experience of fleeing a battle zone on horseback and the accumulated grief of decades of writing elegies for people who did not come home. Asma' did not create a women's education network because things were going well and she had time to think about pedagogy. She created it because the social fabric of the Khilafah was torn, because the community was fractured and grieving, and because she understood, with the clarity that comes from a lifetime of watching things fall apart, that the one thing that could hold a community together when everything else failed was shared knowledge, shared memory, shared identity. Carried not in buildings or institutions that could be burned or conquered, but in the minds and voices of the women who were the backbone of every village and every household in the Khilafah. The Yan Taru was an act of repair. It was Asma' looking at a broken community and asking, what is the most fundamental thing I can do to put this back together? And her answer was, teach the women. Because if the women understand who we are and what we believe and where we came from, then even if the political structures collapse, even if the khulafa fight among themselves, even if the borders shift and the armies march, the community itself will survive because the women will carry it. And this logic, this specific logic, is what separates the Yan Taru from every other educational initiative of its era. Because Asma was not trying to create a school in the conventional sense. She was not trying to produce scholars or train professionals or prepare young people for careers. She was trying to do something much more fundamental and much more ambitious. She was trying to encode the identity and the knowledge of an entire community into the one medium that could not be confiscated or burned or banned, which was the human voice. And she was distributing that medium as widely as possible to as many women as she could reach, because she understood that the more copies there are of a thing, the harder it is to destroy. And if every woman in every village in the Khilafah carried the same poems in her memory, then the knowledge those poems contained was for all practical purposes indestructible. And there is a parallel here to something that happens in the natural world, to the way that certain plants scatter their seeds as widely as possible, not because every seed will take root, but because if enough of them land in enough places, some of them will survive no matter what happens. Asma was scattering knowledge the same way, broadcasting it across the Khilafah through the voices of the Jaji, and trusting that the sheer breadth of the distribution would ensure its survival. And she was right. So let us talk about the mechanics, because the mechanics are where the genius really lives. The word Yan Taru means roughly those who congregate together in Hausa, and the basic structure was this. Asma, working from her home in Sokoto, trained a cadre of literate women who were called Jaji. These were women who could read, who could memorize poetry, and who were willing to travel. Asma taught them her poems, the educational verses she had written specifically for this purpose. Poems in Hausa, with regular meter and rhyme schemes, designed to be easy to memorize and easy to teach through call and response recitation. Once a Jaji was trained, she was given a malfa, a distinctive large straw hat, wide-brimmed, decorated with a red coloring that made it visible from a distance across the flat Sahel terrain. The malfa was not just a hat, it was a credential. It was the visible, recognizable marker that told every woman in every village that this person approaching down the dusty path was an authorized teacher, sent by Asma herself, carrying knowledge that was worth gathering for. And then the Jaji walked. She walked out of Sokoto and into the countryside, following the tracks and paths that connected the villages scattered across the Khilafah, walking for hours, sometimes an entire day, in temperatures that regularly exceeded 40 degrees, carrying no books because her students could not read books, carrying instead a head full of memorized verse and the authority of the malfa on her head. When she arrived at a village, the women would see the hat and know what it meant. They would gather, sometimes in a courtyard, sometimes in the shade of a baobab tree, sometimes in the largest room of someone's mud brick compound, and the teaching would begin. And the method was elegant in its simplicity. The Jaji would recite a line of one of Asma's poems, and the women would repeat it back. Then the next line, and they would repeat that, and then the two lines together, and then the next, building up the poem line by line, verse by verse, until the whole thing was lodged in the memory of every woman present. And because the poems were written with strong rhythmic patterns and consistent rhyme, they were almost musical, which meant that once you had heard them a few times, they started to stick, whether you were actively trying to memorize them or not. The content of the poems was not abstract or theoretical, it was practical. One poem might walk you through the steps of wudu, the ablution before prayer, in the correct order. Another might explain the basic principles of Tawheed, the oneness of God, in accessible Hausa rather than scholarly Arabic. Another might tell the story of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, so that women would have a direct connection to the foundational narrative of their faith. And others told the history of the Sokoto community itself, because Asma understood that a community that does not know its own story is a community that cannot hold itself together. And after the Civil War, the community needed its story more than ever. And when the Jaji had finished teaching in one village, she walked to the next one. And the women she had taught, the women who now carried those poems in their memories, would teach them to their daughters and their neighbors and anyone else who wanted to learn. And in this way, the knowledge radiated outward from Sokoto like ripples in a pond, carried not by books or institutions, but by voices, from one woman to the next, across a territory the size of Western Europe. And the thing that strikes me about all of this, the thing that I keep coming back to, is how precisely engineered the whole system was. Every element of the Yan Taru solved a specific problem. The women could not come to the school, so the school went to the women. The women could not read, so the curriculum was oral. And because the oral curriculum needed to be memorable, it was written in verse, with strong rhythm and rhyme. The teachers needed to be recognized and trusted in unfamiliar villages, so they carried a visible credential, the malfa, that could be identified from a distance. And because the knowledge needed to survive beyond the teacher's visit, the poems were designed for retransmission, structured so that anyone who learned them could teach them to someone else without the jajis needing to be present. This is not someone who had a vague idea about education and hoped for the best. This is someone who thought systematically about every obstacle between the knowledge she had and the women who needed it, and then designed a solution for each one. The milfa for trust, the poetry for literacy, the call and response method for teaching, the Hausa language for accessibility, and the retransmission design for scale. And all of it, every piece, came from a woman sitting in a mud brick compound in Sokoto, writing with a reed pen on paper, in a world where the nearest university was 1,000 miles away and the nearest printing press might as well have been on the moon. No Ministry of Education, no budget allocation, no committee or consultancy or pilot program. Just one woman who had watched her community break and who decided that the best thing she could do about it was teach other women, and who then designed a system to do exactly that, from scratch, using nothing but the materials and the knowledge she already had. And I think there is something genuinely humbling about that, about the gap between the sophistication of what she designed and the simplicity of the tools she had to work with, because it is a reminder that institutional innovation does not require technology or resources or bureaucratic infrastructure. It requires clarity of purpose and an understanding of the problem you are trying to solve, and Asma had both of those things in abundance. Let me try to put you there, because I think the reality of a Yan Taru session is more vivid and more human than any abstract description can convey. It is late afternoon in a village somewhere in the Khilafah, maybe 2 or 3 days' walk from Sokoto. The worst of the day's heat is beginning to break, and the shadows of the baobab trees are lengthening across the red laterite soil. A woman appears on the path leading into the village, walking steadily, wearing a large straw hat with a reddish tint that catches the light, and the women of the village see her coming and begin to gather. They meet in the courtyard of one of the larger compounds, sitting on woven mats spread on the hard-packed earth. Some of them have brought their younger children, who play quietly at the edges of the group. The jaji removes her malfa and sets it beside her, takes a drink of water, and begins. She starts with a poem they have been learning over previous visits, reciting the first line and waiting for the group to repeat it back to her. The voices are tentative at first, then stronger as the rhythm takes hold. She corrects a phrase here, a word there, recites the line again, and they repeat it again. And by the third time, the words are flowing more naturally, the rhythm carrying them along. She moves to the next line, and the poem builds in the air between them, a living thing made of voices and memory and the measured cadence of Hausa verse. Some of the women are hearing this poem for the first time. Others have been learning it over weeks of visits and can recite long passages from memory. The jaji knows who is where in the learning, and she adjusts, spending more time on the newer students and letting the experienced ones help carry the recitation, which reinforces their own learning while supporting the newcomers. And when the formal teaching is done, there is conversation. The jaji brings news from Sokoto, from the other villages she has visited, from the wider world of the Khilafah. She answers questions about practice, about prayer, about the stories in the poems and what they mean. She is not just a teacher in the narrow pedagogical sense. She is a connector, a node in a network that links isolated villages to the capital and to each other. And the knowledge she carries is not just the content of the poems, but the awareness that you are part of something larger than your village, that there is a community of women across this vast territory who are learning the same poems and asking the same questions and building the same understanding, and that you are one of them. And then, as the light fades and the evening salah approaches, the jaji puts her malfa back on, says her goodbyes, and walks to wherever she will sleep that night. Maybe in a compound in the village, maybe at the next settlement down the road. And the women of the village go back to their homes, and the poems go with them, stored in their memories, ready to be recited to their children and their neighbors, carried forward into the next day, and the day after that, and the year after that, and the century after that. And this scene, this gathering of women in a courtyard in the late afternoon heat, this call and response recitation under the shade of a tree, was happening not in one village, but in dozens, possibly hundreds, across the territory of the Khilafah, simultaneously and continuously. A web of voices and memorized verse that connected isolated communities to each other and to Sokoto and to the larger tradition of Islamic learning that Asma represented. Each jaji was a thread in that web, and each woman who learned the poems and taught them to someone else added another thread. And over time, the web grew denser and stronger and more resilient, until it became something that could not be torn apart by any single disruption, because it had no center that could be attacked and no single point of failure that could bring the whole thing down. And that resilience, that distributed, decentralized, almost organic durability was not an accident. It was designed. Asma had lived through enough collapses and enough crises to understand that any system that depends on a single leader or a single institution or a single building is a system that is one crisis away from destruction. The Yan Taru depended on nothing but women and their memories, and that turned out to be the most durable foundation imaginable. And this is what war built. Not in the sense that war was a good thing or that destruction is necessary for creation, but in the sense that Nana Asma took the worst things that happened to her, the flight from Gawakuke, the death of her brother, the civil war that tore her community apart, and she used them. She used them the way she used everything. She turned them into something that could be carried forward, remembered, and taught. The Yan Taru was not born in a moment of peace and inspiration. It was born in the aftermath of the worst years of Asma's life, in a moment when the community she loved was broken, and the people she depended on were gone, and the future of everything her family had built was uncertain. And her response to all of that loss and all of that uncertainty was not despair and was not retreat. Her response was to sit down with a reed pen and write poems that ordinary women could memorize, and then to train women to carry those poems out into the world, walking from village to village with nothing but a straw hat and a voice. And I think there is a lesson in that, not a tidy moral, but something harder and more honest, which is that the most enduring things in human history are not always the things that were built in moments of strength and confidence and surplus. Sometimes the most enduring things are the things that were built in the ruins, by people who had lost everything except the knowledge of what needed to be done and the stubbornness to do it anyway, in the dark, with a reed pen and a broken heart. In part 3, we will follow those poems forward, through the decades after Asma's death, through the British conquest and the colonial period and the birth of modern Nigeria. And we will see how the thing she built, this network of women and voices and memorized verse, turned out to be the one thing that no empire and no government could ever destroy.